Why are the Ten Commandments not our law today? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on Walking Through the Bible.
His word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 5. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 10. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. And Moses called all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive. The Lord talked with you face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up the mountain. He said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. In our last lesson, we concluded by stating that chapters and verses were inserted by men later, and that verses 44 to 49 of chapter 4 serve as the introduction to the third section of Deuteronomy, where Moses reiterates the stipulations of the treaty or covenant made by God with Israel. In this retelling, Moses starts with perhaps the most famous part of the law of Moses, though not the only part, the Ten Commandments. Moses states the reason for him retelling the law to the second generation, for much of it can be found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The reason is so that they may learn to be careful to observe the statutes and judgments of the Lord. Today, people often think that following God is too hard, or that he expects too much of each and every one of us. Such has never been the case, even under the law of Moses. The problem comes when God's people fail to read God's word. That is when we get ourselves into trouble and begin following the doctrines of men rather than the commandments of God. In verses 2 and 3, I'd like us to note who was under this covenant that Moses was retelling here in Deuteronomy. It was Israel. God didn't make this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. He did not make this covenant with Noah, nor did he make this covenant with the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Edomites, or the Ammonites. The law of Moses was only a covenant made between God and Israel. Why do I bring this up? Because there are some out there in the religious world today trying to convince Christians that they are under at least part of this law today, especially the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were part of the law of Moses, all 10 of them. But they didn't make up the whole law. There was more to it than that. When we try and come along and say that we're under part of the law of Moses, but not all of it, we're unwittingly admitting that Christ's sacrifice was not enough. And by doing that, we've fallen from grace according to Galatians 5, 1-6. Does this mean that it is okay for me to go out and murder or steal? No, for God's law before and after Moses prohibited those things. But we must consult God's new law, the New Testament, in order to find out what God expects of us. Not follow the law of Moses as our standard, a law that was meant for Israel alone, and even then, only until the Messiah came and fulfilled it. In verses 6 to 10, we have the first 2 of the 10 Commandments given to us. The first commandment is that Israel was to have no other gods before God. Now, this does not mean that they can have other gods after Jehovah. It means that they are to worship no other gods. Why? Because Jehovah is the God who led them out of Egypt. Jehovah is the only God of this universe and is therefore the only one deserving of our worship. They were not to worship Baal or Ashtaroth or Moloch or Ra or any of the gods of the Egyptians or Canaanites. The Canaanites are about to be expelled from their land for this very behavior, and Israel wasn't to follow in those footsteps. That was the first commandment, and it was about how Israel was to view Jehovah, and it should be a lesson for us that God is to come first in our lives. The second commandment was that they weren't to make idols for worship. That, of course, did mean that they weren't to make idols of other gods and worship them, but that was dealt with in the first commandment. Instead, the second commandment is mainly referring to the fact that Israel was not to worship the true God, Jehovah, using an idol, as we discussed already in Deuteronomy chapter 4. God is the creator of all things and therefore cannot be represented by anything that we can make. He cannot be reduced to a carving, whether it be of gold, silver, or wood. He cannot be reduced to a painting. He cannot be depicted as an animal or as something else that we might see on this earth or in the water. He is God, a spirit, and doesn't desire us to depict him as something carnal and worship that image. He desires that we worship him as the supreme spiritual being. Verse 9 says the reason for this commandment is that he is a jealous God. Usually we think of jealousy as being sinful. Jealousy, though, is simply a desire to keep for yourself that which rightfully belongs to you. Israel's was God's, and he didn't want to lose them by them deciding to go out and serve idols, false gods. He desired that they serve him alone, the only true God of this universe. Thus, this type of jealousy is not sinful jealousy, but righteous jealousy. Verses 9 and 10 then contain phrases that are wildly misunderstood and misapplied. It says that God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate him, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love him and keep his commandments. Some people take from this verse that God imputes the sins of the father on the children. In other words, the children inherit the father's sins. It is evident that some of the children of Israel viewed this passage this way when we read Ezekiel 18. However, this verse does not say that. What is meant here is that the children will often pay the consequences for their parents' sins. Why? Well, for one, children often learn from their parents. So if the parents hate the Lord, it is likely that the children will as well and are thus deserving of punishment. But second, the nature of sin is such that it rarely only affects us, but others as well. If I steal from someone, I have sinned against God, but the person I steal from suffers the consequences of lost property. And my children would suffer the loss of their father for a time when I am put in jail. I am the only one charged with sin, yet others who are innocent suffer the consequences of my sin. We'll continue with the next two commandments, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 11 to 15, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.